Welcome back to the Comics Cube, everyone. Today I am with Mark Nazal and Roland Amago. How are you guys?
Good, good. How are you guys doing?
We're doing good.
I'm doing great. I'm doing great.
The cases are
Thanks.
rising here, Roland.
Well, the cases are
I
rising all
know.
over the world. Same thing in LA. I think I was just telling Roland yesterday. At some point, we were already getting fairly comfortable. We just came from Comic Con. We just did LA Comic Con, and we were already getting comfortable, getting into the groove of things. And then Omicron happens, and I'm like, I really just hope that WonderCon for one won't be canceled, because that would be awful.
So you guys represent Diwata Komiks. Comics spelled with a K because the Filipino word for comics for people who are watching this and don't know is comics with a K. And why do you guys love comics?
You know what? I think that's a really open-ended question. It's like, why don't you love comics is rather the question, right? I mean,
To the
for
point that
me-
you would want to make them.
Well, okay. So first and foremost, I want to caveat this by I think the more traditional role of people that make comics is all they do. That's certainly not the case for us, me and my team. For Roland, it may be to a certain point, but I think ever since we adopted him, he kind of got dragged into a lot of other worlds as well. Like I come from a television-based background, visual effects specifically. If you know a little bit about me, I'm sure
Worked on Gotham,
probably realized,
Yeah.
yes, Gotham,
Westworld.
Westworld, Agents of Shield, Swamp Thing. So I think in a way, I've always loved comics growing up, but as I kind of like launched my professional career, it's always been comics that sort of propelled me to where I needed to be. And also, as a person of color, as an LGBT person, it's one of those things that automatically just kind of like connect with you because you find multiple worlds in it. You could kind of let your imagination soar. But again, going back to the question, why won't you like it? But going back to your question, Duy, why did we decide to how did we love it so much that we decided to make our own comic? I can answer that in two ways. Number one, it's always been a pipe dream. Number two, when we were looking into publishing our comic, for one, we kind of took a look at a lot of the different companies that are established. And one thing we realized was there really wasn't a large diversity point in the upper levels of those organizations. So I was like, okay, well, here we have a comic that we kind of want to tell uniquely with our voices. When I say uniquely with our voices, I want to caveat this by saying that we chose to do our comics bilingual. Right now it's Tagalog because the mythology in it has a Tagalog mythological character, so it didn't make sense for it to be any other. But coming from my part of the family, my mom is actually Visaya, so there's also a part of me that eventually would like to explore that. But one of the things I'm realizing too is that it's harder to sell, or it's harder to try to convince somebody else that won't understand what we're trying to do. It would be almost easier to try to see what we can do and kind of like garner an audience to be able to tell the stories that we want to tell with the voices as we intend them to be. I hope that kind of gives you a little framework of the answer.
Roland, I know you've been making comics. You had one with with Bambi, your wife.
Yeah, we did.
For Peacock. Why comics? Like what? I know it's a lot of work.
Yeah, for me, basically, comics is like an outlet because I really love to draw. It's more on the illustrations. I love to draw. I love to draw. So I use comics as an outlet, and Peacock, like what you were saying, Peacock is one of the first that Bambi and I got to work on more closely because it was closer to us because it revolves around the story of our basically our family and how we face autism. But before that, we did Cardinal Tales and we did Colonel Banahaw for Chop Suey, which was published under Chop Suey before. And yeah, comics for me is an outlet. I mean, I really love to draw, basically.
Well, do you guys have anything that you're very directly influenced by, like any particular artists, writers, books?
Yeah, for me, I started out with the 90s because I did some work for Questor before. And then during that time, anime was a thing, right? So in the late 2000s. So I was influenced mostly by anime. Then as we, uh, as we worked during that time, um, we we started. I started using learning American style again because when we did Carnal Banahaw, that was one of the uh, requirements of the publisher before they didn't want anime. So I tried looking back at Western comics because it during the anime, well, the explosion of anime here, I stopped really looking at Western comics.
Mhm.
So right now I'm trying to go back. So I'm looking at Dan Mora's work for Power
Yeah,
Rangers and um, Sean Gordon Murphy.
yeah,
That is one that I'm trying to study right now for Carmina naman. I like his rusty or his gothic style in inking. So
I get
yeah.
that.
Hmm.
Oh, you, Mark?
Yeah,
Anyone?
for me, I think I thought about this. I kind of like was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure he's going to ask me that. And the reason I kind of had to think about it is because I think for me, it's been mostly a mishmash. And the reason it is a mishmash kind of comes with my background and how I grew up. I didn't grow up in a place where English material was easy to find. I actually grew up in the United Arab Emirates in the Middle East. And
Okay.
so when I grew up, like unlike here or even probably in the Philippines, you could follow comics, right? So you're able to gain a fandom of the things that you find because you can easily follow them, especially here. Like I would say here it's the easiest because you go to your comic book store every week, which I kind of now do, and I think I kind of go in and out of cycles. But back then it would always be sporadic. Like I may be able to find one comic book and never be able to find the following one, or I might be able to find like, you know, um, issue 5, but never find issue 1. So I think it becomes more of like what I resonate with. And right off the bat, one of the ones that I probably resonated to are two. Stefan Cedric has been one of my favorites. Like I've loved, the Witchblade, the Angelus. And then I think as far as like people I did look into specifically because they were Filipino and I was looking for somebody to relate to. I think from a Filipino perspective, Francis Manapul has been one of my
Mhm.
favorite styles. But it really does depend because what I find myself doing when I go to comic book stores is, look, I love the Marvels, I love the DCs. I'm not gonna lie, like I do have a certain fandom to those. But I also tend to find myself looking in the back section to see what else is new because as people that are both creative and also consumers of the content, we tend to want to see what else is out there just so we're not always just going after the same thing and in repetition. But I will say, as far as mainstream comics, one of my favorite ones is Joelle Jones with Wonder Girl. It's like my
Mhm.
absolute favorite as far as more current, more mainstream comics.
She's so good. She's
I
so
know
good.
it's so good. It's like it's one of those things where well, actually right now, the last two things that I highly recommend to anybody, apart from Wonder Girl, I recently discovered this. It's not necessarily new. I kind of ended up picking up, I think, volume 2 of the individual issues before picking up the trade was The Weatherman. It was one of those things where I'm like, I saw it, I'm like, am I really gonna like this? And I just kept reading, and I couldn't put it down. I just kept on getting the next issue because, like, I'm not gonna lie, like there are certain ones where you're like, oh, this is cool. You read it and then you're like, I don't want to go through the next issue. But that was one of my favorites specifically. It wasn't just the art style, it was definitely a combination of the art style and the story that I gravitated to.
How did you guys all find each other?
Okay, so um, how we found each other was this peak of coronation. LA, as you may know, has been one of the hardest hits during the peak of the pandemic. We literally could not go anywhere. So, everybody was working from home, and like I've always been aware, or I've been aware of Filipino comics for a while now, because when I was a student, I was challenged to look into doing material that I connected with, and in doing so, I was able to find out that there was a comics community, even though I did not quite understand how large it was until I met Roland. But long story short, I think I was on the Aswang project, which I think everybody who follows Philippine mythology goes to.
Yeah.
I saw actually Carnal Tales. It was an Esquire PH article that featured Roland's work. And the first thing I said was, wow, this is really cool. And I really appreciated that it was a different spin on the mythology, that it was kind of like going into a deep dive into Catholic mythology, but at the same time, there was something intrinsically cool about it, because as Roland said, as his style was evolving, it wasn't necessarily fully anime, but it wasn't 100% Western either. And that drew me in. I reached out to Roland, we came over Zoom, we gave him a little test. And I think one thing we realized during the test was that we got along really well. I think that's the one thing that I would say is the main component of this collaboration is I'm what you call suplado. I will admit that. So it's not.
Is that true, Roland?
Oh,
no, I didn't get that.
For people that I don't know, I am very protective as an individual. Like, you work in the film industry, everybody wants to be your friend, and not everybody's your friend. But
for people who don't understand Tagalog, suplado means not all that friendly.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I will be the first one to admit to that. Because of that sort of attitude that I'm aware of, I was kind of surprised by how well we gelled together. Something that I really liked about Roland was he immediately respected the fact that we were trying to do something different, that it was both Filipino and American at the same time, but at the same time, it was its own unique entity. And there was no judgment. There was just pure collaboration. I respected his input. He respected mine. There was no judgment at either end. And from that, it went from, we were supposed to just do a 5-page a companion comic to our short, which then became much larger than the short. The short then became the intro to the comics, which is now we're planning for a 6th issue. So does that kind of answer? I know I kind of
answers that question. Yeah.
Multiple aspects, because it's not one pathway, but it's been multiple pathways of discovery. And I will say this, did we go into this with the intent of creating a comics company? No, we did not.
Just in the intent of making a comic.
The intent of making a comic, but I will say this, just as you kind of mentioned how, comics, the Filipino comics, Komiks, is the Filipino version, or the Filipino pronunciation, or whatever, the Filipino word for comics. The one thing I also saw in there was a value of, I've always wondered, right? There's such an interesting comics community in the Philippines, and I've always wondered why that hasn't become mainstream. Because look, you see anime, right? You see anime, and it's clearly distinctly Japanese, but it's now become synonymous all over the world as a certain style and a certain look and a certain thing that comes from a certain place. I actually do believe there is a space for Filipino comics, even though in theory we're maybe perhaps still finding out what exactly that is. I think in my perspective as somebody who, I would say I had some pretty good breaks. It's like when people say, oh, you got to where you are because you worked hard. And I think it's a little bit of both. It's you work hard, but there's also a little bit of luck in there. And so, with that being afforded to me, I wanted to find a way to perhaps, in a sense, not just give back, but also really truly put my money where my mouth is. Because I've always said there's really something cool about Filipino comics, but if it's not being shown anywhere, I think it's not that it's not being shown anywhere. Mostly people don't know it exists, or people don't know where to find it. So if there's any way that we could help it in any small degree, it's worthwhile trying. And I think that's what we're doing, not just for our stories, but also looking to publish Roland's story. In fact, it was a full circle event where the story that made us find Roland is the first title of Roland's that we made an American version of.
Roland, are you based in Manila or?
Yes,
Okay.
I am. I am based in Manila.
So yeah, I've always found it weird, and I don't know if you would agree with me. Comics are huge in Manila. I'm not sure if they're huge in the whole Philippines.
No, I think mostly it's distribution. I guess because it's mostly concentrated here in Manila. I'm not really sure with the other in Visayas and Mindanao
Yeah.
or in the nearing provinces even. Because I think it's more a problem of distribution and lack of like promotional. So
Yeah.
most people tend to, like, as you can see, the conventions are mostly here in Manila. So people from the provinces go here.
That's
Right?
true.
I can actually add to that as an interesting concept. So one of my cousins who now lives here used to live in the Philippines. I think, if I'm not mistaken, she spent some time in Mindanao because that's where my mom's from. And she said, quote her specifically, when our comic came out was, Kuya, I remember that when we were kids, we read a lot of comics, but suddenly they disappeared. And I'm like, they never did. I think what kind of happened over the years is it became niche, is maybe what happened.
Oh, that's yeah. If she's referring to comics with a K,
Correct.
yeah, those the mass produced ones kind of disappeared sometime in the late 90s. I don't know, Roland. I don't. You might know this better than me.
Yeah. The
The funny
like the
comics. Yeah, the
horror
horror
comics.
comics. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
It got with during, I think it's because of low sales
yeah.
and probably because of the our culture that the ones where we just rent. It didn't help with the
Well,
with the selling of with the profit of the ones who make them, I guess.
I actually didn't know that. In fact, it was one of our other co-founders, Joe, who during our interview with Peacock mentioned that that was one thing he did when he used to live in the Philippines as a kid, that he would rent comics. I was like,
Rent comics.
you rent comics? That's such a strange concept because you think about something from a cost perspective, and it's like, why would you rent something you can buy easily? And I guess I didn't really quantify that, and kind of like looking at it from an economic standpoint, it made sense. But yeah,
Yeah, it's not something that everyone can buy easily.
yeah.
Let's put it that way.
It was.
My mom used to run a small store, and I was like, all right, I'm gonna go rent my comics. I regretted it within a week. Come back off the staples. I'm like, oh my God.
Wait, do they ding you when it comes back damaged?
No,
So the next person who probably got it after you did was probably really upset that he was, messed up.
probably. What would you say the mission statement, or what is Diwata Comics all about?
But the mission statement of Duanta Komiks is to tell stories that focus on Filipino-American narratives and Filipino narratives. And apart from telling stories from us, we also are looking to share stories from other creators. And I will caveat that by saying, I wish we could kind of just bring everybody into the umbrella. But in theory, in truth, we are 3 months old, like in terms of incorporation. So by the way, I will say this to all of our fans in the Philippines, thank you so much for all of the interest. I promise you, we will get to you guys. It's just, we're 3 months old and we're still figuring out a lot of logistics, and COVID does not make things easy. Eventually, we do intend to, put our stamp in the Philippines and be able to bring not just Carmina, but even, the US versions of Roland's comic, because I personally, and I'm not sure about you, Joey, but I like the traditional size. Like, to me, there's kind of like a special value in being able to hold and feel that and being able to collect it as such. Actually, there was an interesting executive that told me here that comics are dead. And I'm like, but I go to the comic book store every week and people are always there. So you can't tell me it's dead. Maybe
We
it's
hear that
not,
all the time, and it's always wrong.
but look, here's how I'm gonna say this. I'm also, I guess, entrepreneurial, right? So I told him this. if that's your perspective, I respect it. However, I also want to say that we're doing the comics because we see other greater potential to it, right? As filmmakers, there's nothing more appealing than a fully fleshed story that's happening and you're building a following and you're creating an entire ecosystem around it so that when a story comes out, it's not a surprise. You have people now following. And I can kind of attest that even with us, even in the first 3 months of existence, the first week we had somebody already cosplay as the character. And we thought that was incredibly cool. In fact, that's why these things happen, because the very first week, this girl dressed up as the character immediately. And in the story, the goddess gives her daughter, Carmina, an anting, and she did it with a golden Dorito. And I'm like, we need to do something about that. Like, we need to kind of like make some merch that we can kind of bring, because we saw that people were kind of starting to connect with the character.
How's it feel knowing that you're connecting so early on? Like, some people will work on comics and then, keep trying to push as much as possible. But you guys have been making a lot of noise. It's pretty amazing.
Honestly, it feels great. And the reason it does is because we're realizing, just as how we feel a certain way, that we're kind of like looking to see ourselves in something. It's not just us. There's so many other people feeling that. In fact, one of the most flattering, but not just flattering, but almost heartfelt responses that we got was from this girl. Oh my God, I forgot her name, but it's somewhere on our socials. She said, finding this comic was the equivalent of finding your name in one of those specialized name keychains, because you would never find that name. So to me, that kind of was like, that was really heartwarming. Like, to me, that kind of told us we were doing the right thing. And I say this because in the beginning, when we were kind of concepting not just the character, but also the name of the character, the world of the character, we always knew that we wanted to use Philippine mythology, right? Because it hasn't been as explored. But in the early iterations of the character, we were actually thinking of hiding that part, like making it just be a part of the story, but not clearly stating it. Like, sort of just say it's Carmina, but what the hell is Carmina, right? It really didn't take until closer to release for us to stamp a Filipino-American urban mythology in the front of it. And I think that became a clear determining factor in saying, it's like, yeah, we're here. And I think that's exactly what we're saying as a collective group. Yeah, we're here. It's not that we're the other. No, we're a part of this fabric of society, and that's exactly what we're doing.
I'm very curious about this. I'd like to hear both your thoughts. So, Roland, let's start with you on this one. What, like, every time we do a Filipino thing, I think most Filipino comics do it. Trece obviously does it, the mythology class and all of that. It seems to me that our go-to theme really is our pre-colonial magic and myth. Why do you think we keep going back to that?
I think it's because it's the most known, to say the least, to other people. Because if our target is other countries, I mean, we try to look for something that is easily acceptable in a way, right? I mean, it's a conversation. You don't. I mean, there's a lots of things that our culture is known for also. I mean, obviously, there's also other things that we can talk about. But I think if we wanted, well, for me, if I want to introduce it to people who really don't know, has no idea, a little idea about our culture. I mean, since it's just an introduction, I mean, I'll try to, what do you know about us, right? So that there's a connection again. There's a connection that, oh, I know the Tikbalang, right? I know the Manananggal. I think that's why most of our stories tend to lean on mythologies first and foremost, because like Mark was saying, I mean, we're still not that in that level as the Japanese, not automatic, oh, I know that's Japanese, no, that's anime, that's manga. I can connect it with Japanese, right? So I think yeah, I think that's why we tend to lean more on the most established idea or stories in our culture. Yep.
What about you, Mark?
So I actually want to clarify your question because the key word for me in your question was you said pre-colonial. Can you clarify what you meant by our pre-colonial mythology?
Well, like 1564, the Spanish showed up to the Philippines, introduced Catholicism. Well, I guess they did that when Magellan showed up, which is like
Yeah.
maybe 40 years before that. And so but the local comics that I read the most, like Trece, the mythology class, Skyworld, they'll go back to before that. So they'll be talking about, these monsters, the Mananangals, the Tikbalangs, which my favorite thing about those kinds of monsters is you can tell a global audience, yeah, we're screwed up because like, yeah, we have a vampire, but she splits in half, so
Okay. Well, okay. So I can kind of answer this again in two ways. I never answer things. If there's anything you're probably realizing now is my answer is never like one way. It's always like, okay, that's a part of the framework, but maybe there's something else. And the first thing I'll say is, I don't know if that's true in 100% sense that it's all pre-colonial, because I think even like the Diwata, as you look at, I would argue that there's some colonial influence in there as well. And I would also argue that with all of the other characters. So that's the first thing I'm going to caveat with. But just going based on the creatures, I think there is a uniqueness in the creatures that sort of, as Roland said, identifies it as coming from a certain culture. Like I know that when I work with some of my Cambodian friends, they kind of have like a version of the Manananggal, but instead of like growing bat wings, it's literally just this head that's floating. And in other iterations, I think it has like weird spider arms. But anyhow, I think coming from a creature standpoint, it offers a clear, identifiable creature that kind of comes from a certain mythology. And I think it would behoove us to sort of introduce those stories more and more because because identification and turning mainstream is not going to be up to one project. It's going to be because of repetition over time and exposure over time over multiple projects. Like Tresti alone is not going to do that.
Yeah.
So again, going back into your question, it's because it's easily identifiable. They're unique in their own right. Like I don't know of any other creature. I could be wrong. There might be another culture that has something similar because, the world as an interconnected culture of beings, there are some similarities in other cultures and whatnot, but there's certainly certain visuals that we can make unique to our own, or whether it's one creature or a combination thereof that makes it seem like, okay, that's a Filipino thing, right? I think that's it. I think it's an identification of something that's unique to our culture that others could identify with and say, okay, definitively, that's something from Philippine mythology. I hope that kind of answers your question.
And with that, can you tell me how Carmina specifically came about?
Okay, so all right, well, this is gonna be a little bit of a story.
I like that Roland is laughing. I feel like there's gonna be.
Well, no, he knows because we tell him all of these stories and we started laughing our asses off.
Yeah.
Carmina's story comes in two ways. The first one was, so, when I first started in the industry, I was very much focused on just working on mainstream projects. I only wanted to focus on, my Gothams, my Westworlds, and my whatnots. Then something happened. We won an Emmy. For a lot of people that don't know, the Emmys are like the Oscars for television. Coming from a kid that grew up in the Middle East, who moved here, I didn't think that was possible. So what that kind of did for me was it kind of gave me like should really do something about this. It's like it almost gave me like some weird responsibility of wanting to do something with that. And because one of the things I realized was when that happened, the way that people respond to you became different. We were first nominated in 2015 for Gotham. We didn't win. We arrived at the reception and people were like, "Oh, that's cool. You got nominated," but people ignored you. When we won, people went to you like they knew you. people like approached you like you were the shiniest thing in the world. And I think immediately what I realized was that there's now an opportunity to be able to be like, okay, I now have this credential under my belt. I should kind of do something responsible about it.
So it's a
And for
real
me,
thing for your resume. You're not just showing that off, right? It really
sure,
helps your
it is.
career. Yeah.
Exactly, it does. And people, I think, because of that, people respond to you a little bit differently. And so for me, that moment was like, I should really look into, are there Filipino groups around? Are there other people that are creative like me? And for a while, there was a friend who was running a Filipino-American organization called Film Creative. And through that, I met a couple of different people. Long story short, we ended up taking a writing class with Leo Partible, his band Partible's brother. Not sure if you know who that is, Johnny Bravo and whatnot. But I ended up meeting a lot of fantastic people in this writing group, creatives from different parts of the film industry, actors, writers, musicians, DPs, blah, blah, blah. But what kind of caused the formation of Carmina was this. There were three girls, and by the way, super nice, but they were Filipino Americans in the sense where they grew up here 100%. They were never fully exposed to the mythologies and the culture. And they pitched a story to me and they were like, hey, Mark, how would you like to direct this? And they sent me the script and I literally was like, this is awful. Because there's nothing about the script that connects with your character as Filipino American. It's basically a white script peppered with your faces. So I was like, let's rewrite it.
Did they at least have scenes where they ate things like, lumpia or something? No?
Well, okay. I think that's kind of the superficial part of making yourself a Filipino character, and it didn't, but it was more of like the concept behind it. Like the mythology of it was very Anglo mythology, the names, the connections. It was almost like, it was so generic that I literally was like, no. So I told them, hey, why don't we change this? And why don't we connect each character based on, you? Because, I always argue that the best science fiction or mythology or fantasy stories are the ones rooted or connected to real life in a sense. So I challenged them in a way to kind of, pick a character from Philippine mythology that they could connect it to their individual stories. And quite honestly, make it a part of them as if they've lived it, as if maybe it is a mirror of themselves. And one character particularly stuck to me was Erica. Erica was like, okay, I want to start with me. Like, what am I about? And she's like, well, I'm biracial. My mom is white. My dad is Filipino. So I'm like, okay, let's start with that concept. And from that concept, we were like, okay, well, what if your other half is mythological? And there you go. That was I would say that was the very first instance that the concept of Carmina was born, is about this young woman who finds out that her other half is much more than she realized. And she didn't know too much about it, because at the root of her story, Carmina begins as a discovery of a character who, hadn't had the best scenarios in life, but finds out that she is more than what she expected. And that more actually comes from her other half, which is, her Philippine mythology half.
So Erica is the writer of Carmina, right?
Erica and I are both the writers and the creators of Carmina. And I think I'm kind of proud of that too, because a female character, it's hard to connect to a female character when you yourself are not female, because there's going to be a lot of things that are, very unique to their perspectives, especially in Carmina's story, which has a lot of sensitive issues, sensitive emotional issues, sensitive topic issues that I don't want to spoil for anyone. I didn't feel right writing that without a female counterpart who could offer true perspectives from that character's point of view. And so I literally was like, I co-wrote it with Erica. Like, we would both be sitting and giving feedback on the character. And I think that because of that, the character is so much better. It's so much stronger. And one of my favorite things that I kind of heard as feedback when we presented the character during Peak Off is a lot of the Filipino women in the audience, because obviously it's Peak Off, were like, oh my God, that's so cool. It's an unapologetic Filipina character that actually does not give a fuck. Because our culture, in truth, tends to be very apologetic and tends to be very caring of everybody's opinion.
Yeah.
And it's funny because, and I don't want to spoil this, I know the Aswang Project, thank you for that amazing review, but he ended it with a Philam hero. And I'm like, is she really? And Roland's like,
And it's like, it's 2022. It's like the perfect time for a woman protagonist of color with biracial or what do I say it if one is mythological?
You know what? It's still biracial.
By species?
By species, biracial, sure. But regardless of, we're kind of playing that loosely. And I will say this. We kind of butted heads with some purists when we kind of introduced the concept. And I will say it's fantasy. So you don't have to be such a purist about it. And
you know what, Mark? If you're doing it in a modern day setting, you're done with purism.
Well, true.
And
exactly. And I will even say this, and I think this is something that a lot of people need to understand, is the very fact that I am here means our stories are here. Like, I distinctly remember when I was still in college, I was delivering newspapers with my cousin in Orange County. And my cousin was, he was born and raised in the Philippines, came to the US as an adult. And it was like 2:00 in the morning, because newspaper routes make you deliver stuff like super early, which is like, right, stupid. But anyway, long story short, he was like, hey, Matt, look behind the corner of your eye. And I'm like, what? Like, there's a tikbalang. And I was like, we're in Orange County. But you know what? Like later, 10 years later, I was like, what if? Like, what's not saying that, whether it's by plane, by ship, or by teleportation, a tikbalang didn't follow somebody here from the Philippines. So I think people are missing the point that I think our stories are no longer just localized. Our stories are here just as we're here, just as there are people of Philippine culture, of Philippine descent in Canada, in the United Arab Emirates, in Saudi Arabia. I would argue that our mythological characters also exist in those locales, but meshed with the stories of those locales.
Biracial.
Yes, no, well, not just biracial,
bicultural.
Yeah, multicultural, and those are the kind of stories that we'd like to champion, are multicultural stories, because that's what we are, and that's what a lot of my friends are. Like, I grew up in a society where, depending on the school you went to, became your culture, not by choice but by consequence. Like, I knew Filipino girls who, their mom decided to put them in a French school by choice, not by their choice, but by their parents' choice. And because of the exposure and their friends and the curriculum that they were taught in, it's like they were French, but they never left. They've never been to France. You know what I mean? And I grew up with a lot of those people. And so for me, for a lot of us, we're really just looking to create a character that kind of we could connect with in this new framework of third culture kids, of kids that are beyond just the diaspora. Because you hear a lot about the Filipino-American kids who it's just Filipino-American. Like, I'm actually talking beyond that. I'm talking about all the kids that kind of had to grow up in like 3 different places. There's so much. It's like we are all over the place as a culture, as a people, and our stories are also all over the place. And it would be such a disservice to try to all own it in the locale.
Roland, as the guy whose pencils bring this character to life, what is it like? What is your process, and how do you feel?
I can't really get the credit for all of it, because the illustrations basically is a group effort. Everybody pitched in. I draw the thumbnails. Mark gives me the script, and then we talk about it. And then I draw thumbnails, and then I show it to them. That's what I like about it. I mean, everybody can pitch in. I mean, change the, oh, let's do this instead, or and it molds into something that everybody likes. I mean, yeah, it's a group effort first and foremost. I hope
I can expand on that a
answers your
little bit.
question.
So Roland is really, really good at not just taking script to pencil, but also taking references to pencil.
You think he's
In fact-
underselling himself, Mark?
Oh, he's definitely underselling himself. So, okay, so let me kind of tell you a lot of the process, right? It's like a lot of people think that, okay, you wrote this character and it's vapor character that has really no reference. And that's not true of any writer because, you write based on the things you know. And the other part that I forgot to mention about how Carmina was conceived as a character was there was this one particular year when we took a lot of road trips. And these road trips were through the small towns on Route 66. We avoided the main freeways and we, came across a lot of these like really small towns. I think also I wanted to kind of like share that with everybody in the audience. It's like in the United States, there are very, very, very small towns that, people have forgotten, like that have been forgotten by time. Like they're impoverished, they're quite poor themselves. They no longer have an economy. But one thing that kind of struck me is, especially in like certain spots, there were people of color. And I've always wondered, it's like, what made you come here?
Yeah.
How did you end up here? It's like, one of my favorite most recent trips was on the way to Texas. We stopped by this small town in a farming town in California. And in this small farming town in California, we found an Arabic store. And I got super excited because it's like, what is it doing here? It was an Arabic shop that had like a date shake and all of my treats from childhood were there. And it was in a small farming town in the middle of California. And I think that really kind of just talks about the immigration story in general, because everybody ends up going into different places by consequence through time, through different patterns of migration and whatnot. So going into that, a lot of the references for Carmina are actually our photographs. And even because we did shoot like a short film prior to the comic, a lot of those became Roland's templates into bringing to life. In fact, our DP, Danny, was so impressed by how everything was executed that he said, quote unquote, it almost feels like we shot that shot when Roland finally finished putting it together, even though, Roland was never there. Roland came into the process much later, but he had such an amazing quality of being able to take script, feedback, photographs, references all together into scenes that make it seem like you were there. So that truly is a credit to his artistry.
See, don't sell yourself short, Roland. Come on.
I think my background in architecture helped because I was able to like make a visual, of what the house looked like, what the town looked like. So I guess it's a collective knowledge of the things that I studied and continuously studying because honestly, my art style is still a work in progress. I mean, I try to learn new things. For Camina, the hardest thing for me was it is based on real people. And I didn't really have a background in anatomy, so right now I'm trying to study with the help of YouTube, with the help of some books online. I guess it's a collective knowledge which really helped from what Mark is saying. That I guess that helped in bring about how the comics look like.
And I will say this, and a lot of people already responded really well to book one. And I will tell this to the audience who are maybe here who've had their first issue. The first issue is a fantastic starter. Roland at every page in the second issue keeps on outdoing himself. So I am like super excited to share issue 2 because while issue 1 was a great introduction and a great presentation to bring you into this world, I believe her character, her story, and the visuals truly get defined in issue 2.
Awesome. So, what can you tell me the basic plot of Carmina will be? You know, it's going to run for 6 issues. And how often will you be releasing the issues?
So, all right. The standard pitch for Carmina is it's about a young woman. I wouldn't even say biracial at this point. A young woman who lives in a small town in rural New Mexico, in a New Mexico trailer park town. I want to be very specific in that because that has a certain visual to it. In a New Mexico trailer park town, who finds out that she's half Duanta, that her other half is otherworldly, and that she's a lot more powerful than she realizes. And you know, she comes from not the best of situations, coming from coming from an impoverished background, but also there are other challenges in her life that are not necessarily supernatural. But I think, you know, as the comic sort of started expanding, we started bringing in not just Philippine mythology, but also characters that are bespoke, that don't necessarily belong in the mythology, but rather characters that now are able to interact with this world that are, you know, completely fictional. Going to your release schedule, I think the first issue obviously we released. The second issue comes out during WonderCon, and I wish I had more, but quite honestly, we are still in active development throughout. We have our outline, but I don't want to commit to telling you an exact thing and then kind of miss those marks. All I know is the second issue is definitely targeted towards WonderCon, which is April 2nd, if Omicron does not delay that.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully
Well, I
not.
mean, it's January. Hopefully it'll be contained
I
by
agree. I mean,
and
I hope so.
that there will be no new variants.
Well,
What is how can people find out how can people follow you on social media or on the internet?
They can find us on Duanta Komiks, super simple. And again, I want to once again restate this because we've had such an interest coming from the Philippines. It's both flattering and nerve-wracking at the same time because you know, you don't want to disappoint those people, but at the same time, you also know logistically it is a little bit more difficult. I think we have a partner in mind who, you know, will be reaching out to hopefully be able to expedite being able to bring it to the Philippines. So make sure to follow us on socials. For people in the United States, obviously, duatacomics.com will be expanding where we distribute our comics in 2022. So definitely look out for that. But apart from Carmina and our stories, I highly, highly, highly encourage everyone to not just look at the Filipino-American titles, but also the Filipino titles, which include the Fantastic Colonel Tales and also Kayel Molo's Darahug, which, you know what, it makes me a little nervous because it's a little bit more risque, but I do think it's a story worthwhile telling because it's unique and it has a perspective that's not a common perspective, even though it might be hard to show because of the themes involved.
And talk about, you know, with your background in Hollywood, talk about any plans to bring anything of any of this to
Well,
Hollywood.
actually, we've already shot a very good, let's just call it it's a short, but really what it is it's a fantastic pitch project. The short itself is a pitch to showcase not just the viability of the character, but it also allows people to see what's possible with a character that's not what you expect, because you know that's what she is.
Any more plans for the future?
Plans
you'd
for
like
the
to share?
future are to finish the short, finish the 6-issue arc that we outlined. I wish we could kind of like say much more than that, but actually there is something else that I wish we could do. I hope that things are going to get contained sooner than later, so we're able to visit the Philippines. And I think in turn, we're also looking to see if, you know, Roland first and then eventually Kayel would be able to visit here and kind of join us during the conventions. So those are the things we're looking forward to in 2022. We're still determining a lot of logistics, so we'll see.
Roland, do you think we'll be able to contain the virus in time for them to visit the Philippines?
I hope so. I hope so. I'm praying constantly that at least we can contain it so that we can At least locally also, we can continue our reader conventions also.
Yeah, I miss
Right?
going. I
Yeah,
do
I
miss
mean,
going.
we
And
really
I will
miss
add one last thing. Speaking of conventions, I think from our first two experiences with Comic-Con Special Edition and LA Comic-Con, it's really clear that you connect with your audience differently. It's like, you can say all you want about virtual stuff, it's not the same. I'm glad we were able to connect with not just Filipino audiences during those events. I'm sure you've seen the photographs. It was so easy to really just talk to people who were looking for new stories and kind of just not even sell them on the concept, but rather pique their curiosity enough that they picked it up without any reason, even though it was completely new. One of the most heartwarming things was this little African-American girl. She was probably like 7, no older than 7. And she came up to our table and asked her mom if she could buy the comic. And that to me was super cool.
Awesome.
Because, here's somebody that has no connection to our culture, but just resonated with the artwork, period.
That's awesome. That's you drawing that in, Roland.
Yeah. I'm still trying to get it all in, because I'm happy that everybody's it's getting a positive feedback.
Is it
And
hard
I'm
to
trying
believe?
For now, yeah. So I'm still trying to get it all in.
Anything else you'd like to say, Roland, before we close?
Again, thank you for all the support. That I wish I could have been there to be able to meet the guys who bought the books, and hopefully we contain this Omicron and be able to show there in the next conventions.
Thank you, guys. This has been fun.
Thank
Good.
you.
Good luck, and I hope.
Yeah, it was such a pleasure, Duy. And also, I will say this as a closing statement. When we do send the samples to the Philippines, please give us your address. We'll make sure you have one.
Thank you very much.